In 2023, the Education Board, along with the Executive Committee of Southern California Conference, decided to do a survey and research on the subsidies that churches owe schools each year. A committee was put together called the Subsidy Research Committee that has been meeting over the last year, mostly last year and early this year, and throughout the summer. Most of this research is done through surveys of individuals that are involved, including pastors, educators, and many others. A lot of the other research has been done by interview and many conversations by the committee, by me. We've put together this report. Contrary to many people's belief, the school system in the Adventist denomination was the last institution to get started, according to George Knight. Publishing was in 1849, the centralized church organization was 1863, and the healthcare, the hospital systems, were in 1866. Finally, schools started in 1872. In Southern California Conference, the first elementary school was in 1898, and the first secondary school was in 1902. In 1905, the Southern California Conference purchased the property that now holds Loma Linda University, and shortly thereafter split the conference into two, so we have Southeastern and Southern. By the 1920s, the General Conference session was involved in schools throughout the world, but in particular, North American Division. 70% of tuition for teachers' salaries in 1926 were paid by the General Conference. But by 1930, schools were in debt. So the GC offered a payback program, but of the 14 of the 54 schools that remained in debt, the rest drifted back into debt. And ever since then, 1932, the GC committee reiterated that schools should not be in debt. And then you go forward throughout the history of the GC committee, and you find the schools were continuously in debt. In 1942, policies were made that the academies and elementary subsidies should have 5% of the mission offerings to go to education. And that began sort of the local support of local schools and academies. By 1950, universities and colleges were what were being supported by the North American Division, with just a few colleges being supported by the General Conference. It became the responsibility of the local conference to take care of the elementary and academy schools. During the 1987 Southern California Conference constituency session, the delegates voted the following, which is interesting because it is the exact same words that were used in setting up the 2023 research committee. Concern was expressed over the varied methods used by the schools to determine church subsidies. Some felt the school expectations were greater than what the local church could manage and still maintain other church programs. As a result, it was voted to have a proposal brought back at a later constituency with a plan to bring some relief to overburdened church. It took them 6 years, but in 1993, they finally brought a new proposal. After 6 years of research, the 1993 proposal was brought to the Southern California Conference constituency session. During that session, this proposal was approved. Included in that proposal was the idea that each church was to support one elementary and one secondary school. However, the enforcement part, that has never happened. For instance, when a church is 1 month delinquent, the education department would send a letter to the church. The big problem was that people in the education department didn't know for 3 months, 6 months, sometimes a year, that a church was delinquent in its subsidies. So this part of the enforcement just never happened. And so what we did as a research committee was figure out what is the cause and how do we fix this proposal that was accepted in 1993. The committee focused on two major questions. Does the current policy requiring every church to support an elementary and a secondary school need to be changed? And if so, in what ways? And secondly, is Adventist education affordable today for families, churches, or the local conference? To figure this out, I started doing research online and other places wherever I could find it. I found every research project by anybody who did research on, for instance, dissertations by either pastors who were getting their doctorate or teachers who were getting their doctorate. Most of the dissertations focused on pastor-educator relationships. Depending on which one, if a pastor did the dissertation, the focus was on how the educators need to be more involved in the church. If the educator was the one doing the research, then it focused on the pastor and how the pastor needed to be more involved in the school. By 1992, Osborne did a research project for the division that showed enrollment declining from 10.4% of the membership to 3.9% between the 1960s and 1992. The education budget also declined from 19.6 to 16.9%, at least in Southern California Conference. So 16.9% of the conference budget goes to education. Again in 1992, a group of professors from Walla Walla and Andrews got together and did a research project on increasing membership. They proposed that membership had dropped from 205% increase in the 60s to just 62.4% increase in the early 90s. And enrollment for the schools went from increasing 15% on average a year to declining pretty much ever since then. In 2015, Dr. Thomas Tomby, who used to be the education superintendent here in Southern California Conference, suggested through a paper that is available at La Sierra that requires subsidies are not doable. He also was very passionate about principals being too busy. They needed more money to come back from the GC and the NAD, and that the churches pay a flat amount of 2 to 5% of their tithe equivalent to subsidy. In the same time, the North American Division had a task force that was put together in 2014, actually. They reported in 2016 with 8 challenges that identified and recommended solutions. You can find these in the report that is available online at the constituency website. I looked at many of the denominational private schools, Catholics, Baptists, non-denominationals, and other schools, all of them struggling with the same issues. But the non-denominational schools that are growing are charging double what Adventist schools are charging about, and they are also supporting their schools through endowments. So scholarships are all from endowments. No local churches are giving any kind of subsidies. So then we talk to local conferences, other conferences across. According to Barrett Von Pulley, the education superintendent for the Pacific Union, all conferences are struggling with the church subsidy issue. How do we get churches to keep paying what they can't afford to pay? So Northern California has created a formula that's based on 14.75% of the tithe amounts that is returned to schools on a per student basis, while Southeastern holds churches accountable through a conference committee that ends up with no teacher contracts if subsidies are more than 2 months delinquent. Now, the problem I have with that is, why are we punishing the school for what the church is not doing? Other conferences, such as in Florida, have somebody in the business office that all they do is finances for schools. So there's lots of different ways that conferences are trying to solve this problem, and we will continue to research it ourselves. One of the things you need to know is 54.7% of student bodies have declined since 1997. At the same time, membership has dropped 24.7%. And interestingly, baptism have dropped also the 54.7%. Now, do not draw a correlation between the 54.7%. There is no way for us to show or prove that those baptisms lost were all kids from schools, because we can't tell you which of the baptisms are kids from our schools specifically. Our denominational database does not allow for that. But the opening enrollment up through 2023, last school year, is declining, and Also, that includes going from 22 schools to 14 schools today. So we had 22 schools if you include the academies that have also an elementary as one school. We had 22 in 1997. Today we have 14. One of the issues the committee had initially was getting responses back that made for accurate data. The first surveys that we did 4 surveys, one for educators, one for pastors and elders, then one for treasurers of schools and treasurers of churches. So those were the 4 surveys. Of the churches, we got 52 back, which is about 1/3 of the churches. And of the schools, we got half of the schools back. That is still not enough to make it a valid and reliable source. So in June, the education department went through directly to the schools themselves and asked for the data from only the schools. The other problem with the original research was that the numbers that were given by the churches were different than the numbers given by the schools, and the schools had different names of churches than churches said they were supporting. So there's a major conflict going on, lack of data as to who is responsible for what. This includes 100%, all schools responded, which meant that we had 155 churches and companies that the Treasury Department tracks through tithe. So of that, 96 of them support one school each. Now, many of those are the academies, and which also have elementary. 40 of those support 2 schools, so 1 elementary and 1 secondary. And 1 is very devoted and supports 3 schools. However, that last piece, 18 churches support no schools. Churches and companies and groups are 3 different types of designations of congregations. This includes all churches, companies, and groups. Some of our groups are already supporting a school or multiple schools, while some of our churches are not. So we took the average tithe percent of subsidy to figure out how much our churches are giving to their schools. So the churches that are supporting 1 school or an academy and an elementary average about 5.8% of their tithe equivalent. 2 school churches average 8.8%. That 1 3-school church averages 13.5%. Overall average that the churches are giving to the school is 7.5% of their tithe goes back to the school. By the way, that equals about $2,050,000 each year, or this last year. The highest percentage was 54.1%, and those are the small churches that support 1 church, 1 school. Mostly, not all. There were several in that high percentage that were giving to 2 schools and churches that were that high. However, there's also a low percentage of 0.1%. Now, that could be for many reasons. One is that many of the churches or schools are not counting subsidy as subsidy. They're counting it as scholarship in their books. So it's hard to track it. I'm not real sure why some of our largest churches are down at that 0.1, 0.2, 0.3% of their tithe is going to schools. I know it's not true, but I can't back it. It doesn't add up if I don't use the numbers they sent. Overall, 41 churches are giving over that 7.5%. If you take that number and instead of using local tithe, you use local giving as a percentage, it was 8.9% of local giving is going back to the schools. Now, the problem with using local giving is that we have no way of tracking exactly what that local giving is about. For instance, I know some churches are doing major campaigns for capital improvements, and some of that money is not really local giving, it's capital improvement giving. Or someone may pass away and leave a trust or a will or monies to the church, and that is included in that local giving, and that sometimes is a huge amount of money. So using local giving is a difficult piece, though it is now being tracked. It's easier to go with the tithe numbers, so we stuck with the tithe numbers. One of the questions the committee was confronted with was, is Adventist education affordable? According to all of the numbers that we received, tuition, which we could pull off the web, what is the tuition amount? How many students do we have? About $6,927 per student families are paying for their students to go to Adventist education. The church subsidy, if you take all of the church subsidies and add them together and divide them by the number of students, you have $1,399 per student is going to schools for subsidy support so that the families don't have to pay that part. And then Southern California Conference pays 16.9%. Their tithe that they maintain, they keep, that equals about $5,600 per student. What's interesting is that breaks down to 50% of the cost of education is being paid by the families, only 10% by the church subsidies, and 40% by the conference. Now, it's also interesting to notice that $16,637 is the California average private tuition. If you add together elementary and high school or academy level costs of education across the state, they average that to be $16,637. Our average across all of our education system is $13,965, so we're about $3,000 less than the average of the state of California private schools. One of the things I wanted to figure out is where's the problem, where are the misfits within this system? And it looks at centralization, who makes the decision? It looks at formalization, how many documents do we have? Knowledge exchange structures, how are the systems exchanging information? Incentive structures, information systems, and the configuration and coordination of control. By running the results of surveys through this software, I came up with some system errors that needed to be looked at. To do that, I used what is called a causal loop diagram, or CLDs. And a system CLD, on the right side of the screen, you'll see an example of one. The one that I ended up with is far too big to even begin. Even if I tried to pull it out, you wouldn't be able to read it because it's so humongous to include all of the issues that we are dealing with here. Bottom line, all of the links and the loops tell me where the pressure points are and where the possibility of change might be. We're all part of a system, and that system is how we get along. We know how things are supposed to function. For instance, our bodies are systems. The body has the circulatory, the heart system. If that heart stops beating, or if you move the heart to a different place, it's not going to work. And so all of these body systems must be functional. While the heart is integral, it's not the only part that's integral. You have to have skin. You have to have the endocrine system. All of the systems are important to work in that system of the body. The same is true of our schools and our churches and the entire system of Adventism. So what is a system? A system is a group of interacting, interrelated, or interdependent components that form a complex and unified whole. So Southern California Conference is part of a unified whole. It's part of the Pacific Union, then the North American Division, and then the General Conference. A system's parts must all be present for the system to carry out its purpose optimally. If a part is missing, something will go wrong. I like to use the illustration of a bicycle. A bicycle has a chain that's part of the energy system, I call it. It's actually part of the rotator and the gears and all of that. If you take the chain off, the system is broken. That bicycle will not move. You will be pushing that bicycle instead of pedaling that bicycle. Secondly, a system's parts must be arranged in a specific way for the system to carry out its purpose. In this situation with a bike, if you take that chain and you hang it over the handlebars, it's still not going to do you any good. You have the chain, you have all the parts, but if it's hanging over the handlebar, it's not where it belongs. And number three, the systems have specific purposes within a larger system. That chain has a bigger purpose within the larger system of the bicycle. And four, the systems maintain their stability through fluctuation and adjustment. If there is no fluctuation and adjustment, it becomes a taut system and that chain will break. So all chains on a bicycle have to have a little bit of fluctuation. If it's too tight, you can't pedal. If it's too loose, the chain will fall off or break. Always, systems provide feedback. It's whether we're listening to the system or not as to what we should do about what's going on within the system. So how do they do that? Number one, the top level is events. Events are snapshots in time. Events cause a reaction to each new event. So in this situation, for instance, a church can write a check, but not mail the check. And the next month, they can write a check to the school and not mail the check. Pretty soon you have a stack of checks that are sitting on a treasurer's desk somewhere that have not been sent to the school. That's when we become a pattern. When patterns or trends or changes in events over time that is measurable. 6 months of checks sitting on a desk or 6 months of not paying is a pattern. Patterns are trends or changes in events over time that are measurable. Everything about a system has to be measurable. If you can't measure it, and that's why we had to redo some of our research because it wasn't viable, it wasn't reliable. So we had to have something that was measurable, that was valid and reliable. In Southern California, one of the trends that I know is true, actually, of all conferences across the US, is that December, you can almost always count on double the normal tithe of other months. That's a trend that happens every single year. So if you just see the events and the patterns, you don't see what's the real issue. You don't get the total feedback. You have to go to the structure or the transformation. If you can see the structure, and this is what you would call systemic issues, or you could call it strategic availability. The cause of the pattern and the events react the same over time, and that way it's measurable. I love this, the sentence at the bottom here. A system's behavior is always a function of its structure. If a system behavior is acting wonky or not the way it was intended, then you have to look at the structure. So for system thinking, you have employees and personnel, paid and volunteer. That's all one system that we did not delve into in this study. It could have been, but we did not. The student system, how do we get students? That's a whole nother issue. We did not look into that. Content, what do students study? That was not a purpose of our study, of our research project. Context, what is the culture? What is the atmosphere? What is the context around which the school exists? We did not look into that either because that was not the focus of our study. However, 3 systems do stand out, though the focus was on the last system. Administration management, governance and boards, and finance all kind of impact each other, but our major focus was on finance and the subsidy system within finance. You see, the union and the Southern California Conference are connected both ways. They can send, Southern California sends money up, union or division sends money down. The Pacific Union sends money to Southern California Conference, and Southern California Conference sends money up to the union, and the union then sends it to the division. That is a system, the way the system is supposed to work. The Southern California Conference sends money to the church, and the church sends money back, where the division does not send money directly to a church. For instance, next summer, the division is working on an evangelistic campaign that they are encouraging all churches to apply to become a part of, and they will give you some money, I forget how much, to do that. In order to be a part of that, you have to apply it at the division level. But the money that you get at the local church level is going to come to Southern California Conference, and they will give the money to the church. They will send the money to the church. So there is a direct connect between Southern California Conference and the church. The school and the conference are also connected. The money goes back and forth to help pay teachers' salaries and to cover insurances and all kinds of things that go on between the Southern California Conference and the school. There's also an accountability. The union and division, the division is responsible for the accountability of the unions. The union is responsible for the accountability of the local conference or the Southern California Conference. The Southern California Conference holds the church accountable. At the same time, they hold the schools accountable. This is really, really important. There is no line between the church and the school. The church does not hold the school accountable. The school does not hold the church accountable. How is that? Because when there was one-on-one church to school, back in the early days of our education system, we had one church, one school. One of our schools has 47 churches that are supporting it, while other schools have one church that supports it. So there's a big unfairness, but there's also a lack of connection, financial connection. I'm looking only at finance. If you're going to talk about governance, yes, there's a board that is between the church and the school. Church people are on the school board. The school people are on the church board. But that's the governance system, not the finance system. I'm talking here only about the finance system. So there's a missing link between the school and the church. This is what our executive committee and education board and educators will be looking at in the future to change. The financial system column starts with the accounting and software standardization. Right now, every school has its own accounting software package that may or may not talk to anybody else. It's very, very hard for schools to find accountants that are trained accountants. So they've taken volunteers and sometimes, or people that just know how to do addition and subtraction. That is not accounting. You could not pay me to be an accountant, but the accountants are very, very important in the process of our system. So one of our suggestions is look at moving the school accounting into the Southern California Conference Treasury, where they will have help so that when something is wrong with the system, the accounting system, they can have the help they need to fix whatever is not working the way it's supposed to. Another option is to standardize subsidies across the entire conference. So all schools, all churches can have the same subsidies as churches, and churches are paying those same subsidies. Standardize the tuition. We have so lowered our tuition in some of our schools that there's no extras. There's no music, there's no STEM, there's no robotics, there's no PE. There's many of the extras that families are looking for have disappeared. By standardizing our tuition across the board, hopefully we can improve that and include some of those extras that incentivize families to send their students to our schools. Another way that we can fix this is to move toward that endowment fund idea. I am not a financial person, but my guess is that about $55 million in investment in an endowment fund could produce around $2.1 million a year, which is about what it takes to cover the subsidies. If we move to an endowment fund, people can then apply for scholarships directly from that fund, or the schools, and there's lots of ways of doing it, and the education department will be looking at that. The other parts of these are also possible actions that can help with the whole issue and start fixing the system errors that we have uncovered. But our hope and our goal here today is to help you understand why some of these changes may be coming down the pike in the future, and to help our schools succeed. By my count, I'm a futurist, I look more at the future than I do the past, believe it or not. In the future, by 2034, we will not have schools at the rate we're going. So we have to do something different now. This is not something that we can wait around for. So I thank you for your attention, and may God bless our school systems.